Chapter 12. Shadows of My Mind. Everyone seemed more subdued at dinner. Their voices were low and there was very little laughter. Those who were unable to feed themselves were seated together and served by attendants. The rest of us moved through the cafeteria line. There were two choices for an entree, turkey or halibut. Everything smelled and looked good. Mrs. Anderson supervised with pride. If I closed my eyes and listened, I couldn't tell I was in a clinic. "Does this cafeteria remind you of your school?" Lawrence whispered from behind me. "It's familiar," I said, "but I can't recall anything specific." "I went to a private school," he said. "I always did. The food was pretty good there too, and it didn't have many more students than the patients are here," he added, but he sounded like he wasn't happy about the experience. "Some of us back here are hungry," Megan said, to prompt us to stop talking, take our food, and move down the line. I hurried along, noticing how Mary Beth skipped taking bread or dessert and then pushed her food apart as if to let anything touch would contaminate everything. This time Megan, Mary Beth, Lulu, Lawrence, and I all sat at the same table. No one else seemed to want to join us. "What are you waiting for?" Megan asked me. "Eat before it gets cold." I hadn't realized I was sitting there not touching any silverware while everyone else, even Mary Beth, had begun. "I don't know," I said, sensing a blank that wanted to be filled in desperately. "But you're right. I feel like I'm waiting for something before we eat, something that should happen first." "My daddy used to tell us all the time about his day at work at dinner," Lulu said. "And then he would tell us stories when he and my mother were young. He was probably never there for dinner. Didn't your parents get divorced when you were a baby?" Megan reminded her. "I still remember," Lulu said, and glanced at me to see if I believed her. I smiled at her. She smiled back. "Maybe you said a prayer first," Lawrence suggested. "At my private school, the headmaster led us in saying grace before every dinner." "Yes," I said. "Maybe," I nodded. "I think that's it," I added excitedly. "Okay, I'll say it. Everyone wait. Hold your fork, Lulu." Megan started ahead and raised her arm slowly toward the ceiling. "Grace," she declared, clapping her hands. Then she dug into her potatoes, laughing. "Yes," I said, nodding. "Yes, that's it. You're right, Lawrence. I can remember that. I think I can remember the Bible. We read the Bible," I continued. Lawrence smiled, his eyes happy for me, and he nodded softly. "That's good," he said. "If everything comes back to you this fast, you'll leave here before you know it." "Goody goody for her," Megan said. She started to eat again and then paused to consider me. "Do you really remember something?" "Just vaguely. Someone reading. It's like I'm remembering myself reading." I shook my head. "It doesn't make any sense. I hear a different voice, but I see a face so familiar to my own. It's like I'm looking at myself." "That doesn't sound like anything," Megan said after a moment of thought. "Sure it does," Lawrence said, suddenly assertive. Megan widened her eyes, and he turned back to me. "You better have something to eat," he suggested softly. "You'd be surprised at how much strength all this mental work takes." "Yes," I said, and started. Even that tiny bit of memory returning filled me with encouragement and stimulated my appetite. I really am going to get better, I thought. Halfway through the meal, I glanced at Mary Beth and saw how she was eating. But after every bite, she wiped her mouth with her napkin and put the napkin in her lap. I caught sight of it after she took another mouthful of fish and saw that the napkin was filled with food she had spit back into it. Actually, she was barely eating anything. The attendant named Billy, who had greeted Clara and me at the door when I first arrived, had been standing on the side with another attendant watching our table. Suddenly he rushed over and pounced. "Mary Beth, you're spitting out your food," he accused. his hands on his hips. He nodded at her plate. No, I'm not. Let me see your napkin, he demanded. Come on. We've got strict orders from Dr. Thomas about you. I'm eating, she cried, on the verge of tears. Leave her alone, Megan said. He turned to her. Mind your own business, Megan. There's plenty to mind there, he said. He turned back to Mary Beth. Mary Beth? Panic. Mary Beth's panic had flushed her neck and face. She looked like she was trembling in her seat. I felt sorry for her. Her eyes were darting about, searching for some avenue of escape. You're scaring the hell out of her, Megan cried. Billy ignored her and continued to hover over Mary Beth. The doctor said if we see you spitting out your food, we've got to tell him, and then they'll put you upstairs and force feed you, Billy reminded her. The tower, Megan declared. Don't even think of trying it, she told Billy. She even poked him in the rear with her fork. He spun on her again. Look, he said, if you interfere with our work, with our other patients, you'll end up there too. And don't you ever poke me with anything. That's an exhibition of violence, he chastised, with a smile that revealed a row of glittery white teeth. And you know what that means, he threatened. When he glared with fury at Megan, I reached under the table, took Mary Beth's full napkin from her lap and dropped it in my place instead. She glanced at me gratefully. Billy turned back to her. Well, hand up that napkin. Come on, he said, gesturing with both hands. She reached into her lap and gave it to him slowly. He seized it. The disappointment registered on his face when he opened and nothing fell out. Megan roared and then clapped. Billy Screwball screws it up again, she cried, clapping her hands over her head. Conversations throughout the cafeteria stopped and everyone looked our way. Cut that out, he told her. Megan continued to clap, which caused one of the boys I had been playing chess with earlier to started clapping too. His friend followed, then the whole table joined in. Soon everyone in the cafeteria who could clap was clapping. Billy's face took a look of rage and he threw the napkin back at Mary Beth. Then he marched back to his position in the cafeteria, shouting at the patients to quiet down. Megan finally stopped clapping and soon everyone followed. One boy, however, kept breaking out into applause and laughter for no reason every once in a while during the remainder of the meal. Thanks, Mary Beth whispered to me. That was pretty smart, Megan told me. You saved her butt with that quick thinking. Lawrence smiled at me too, his gaze steadier now and full of pride and admiration. You better eat something, Mary Beth, or I'll feel responsible and guilty if you get sick, I told her. She took a fork full of fish and put it in her mouth, chewed demonstratively, and turned toward Billy as she did so, and he looked away with disgust. Billy's such a dork, Megan said. She glared back at him until he turned his back to her and kept his eye on the other patients. He doesn't scare me with his threats. He knows if he so much puts a finger on me. She turned back to me and stopped talking and eating. What's wrong with you? She asked. That girl, I said, nodding to the girl who sat across the cafeteria from us. What is she doing? Megan looked. Oh, that's Tamantha Stewart. She's mute. She won't talk. So she does that sign language to communicate. It's so stupid. She's not deaf. I don't know why they pamper her. She should just be given shock treatment. What? She asked me when she saw the expression on my face to get more empathetic. I know what she's saying with her hands. I understand it, I said, even surprised myself. Really? That's awesome, Lawrence said. Someone you know must have been deaf, he added. I looked at him. It was as if a thick, heavy door had been opened, just an inch or so, and there was light streaming through. I thought I saw a face peeking out at me through the darkness, but who was it? My eyes began to blink rapidly, uncontrollably. I wanted to see who was behind that door. I felt as if I were struggling tug-of-war to open that door, a little bit more, pulling and pulling. I couldn't stand the effort. Laura, he said, are you all right? You're upsetting her, Megan said. What am I doing? I'm not doing anything, he moaned. Laura, he said, turning back to me. Suddenly it just came over me. I heard a cry that had been haunting me ever since I arrived. Someone was desperately crying out for my help. I spun around in my seat and looked behind me and to the sides. What is it, Laura? Lawrence asked. Laura, someone is crying. The noise in the cafeteria became a roar of the sea. There was water everywhere. The wind itself was calling my name. Laura! Laura! I felt nauseated. I started to shake my head, and then my whole body began to tremble. I was holding the table so firmly that the dishes began to clink. A glass fell over. Megan shouted to Lawrence because I was tipping backward. He seized my chair, but I started to slide off of it. My body felt as if it turned to liquid. All my bones melted. I was pouring toward the floor. Lawrence held me, but I slipped from his grip and fell down, 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 waving my arms about me. Billy and a female attendant came rushing over to us. What's wrong? Does she have epilepsy or something? Someone asked. It sounded like Megan. My tongue was swelling and I couldn't get any air. I felt myself drooling and then I started to scream, or at least I thought I did, and then all went black. When I woke this time, I was back in my room. A man in his white lab coat was taking my pulse, and one of the night nurses was beside him. She's stabilizing, he said. Laura, how are you doing? I blinked rapidly. His voice echoed. Laura, how are you? Laura? Laura. No, I screamed, or at least I thought I did. My whole body began to tremble terribly. It was as if the bed were coming apart beneath me. I'm sinking. Hold her, the man said. Easy. There was a pinprick in my arm, and then after a few moments, a wave of darkness washed over me. My body sank deeper and deeper into the bed. I felt like I was going underwater. I tried desperately to stay conscious, but the wave after wave of blackness was rushing in, pushing me further and further down. The sound of my name drifted off, and then I was asleep. When I woke up again, there was sunlight streaming through the curtains. I heard the sound of water being run in the sink, and the nurse emerged from the bathroom with a washcloth and a pan. She put the cloth on my face as I blinked and blinked, trying to focus in on something that made sense to me. So you're finally awake. Good, she said, twisting her mouth. You gave everybody a bad time again, I heard. She lifted the cloth from my forehead and gazed down at me. I opened my mouth, but my voice wouldn't work. So let's hear about it. How are you now? Do you have any pain, any nausea? Well, she demanded when I was silent. I shook my head. Are you hungry? I thought about it. I was a little hungry, but when I went to say yes, nothing happened. Well, she asked, can't you talk this morning? Talk, I thought. Could I ever talk? I tried to speak, and only a deep guttural sound emerged. The nurse looked surprised. What is it? She asked. I lifted my hands, and as naturally as people speak, I began to sign. What the? She stepped back and watched as I spoke through my hands. Yes, I'm hungry, I told her, but where am I asked. She shook her head. This is a surprising turn of events, she said, looking quite impressed. The doctor will be here in an hour. If you want to eat breakfast, you should get up now, she said. I signed okay and rose from the bed. I felt groggy, but strong enough to stand. Some more clothes were being brought here for you last night, she told me. They're all brand new, apparently. Everything still has the tag on it. Some of it's in the closet, and some is in the dresser. Choose what you want to wear and get dressed. Come out to breakfast, she said. Well, I signed okay. So you can't talk now, is that it? Fine. I could use a little more quiet around here, she said. I'll see you in the cafeteria. Get dressed, she ordered, and left the room before I could ask her where the cafeteria was. Confusion resembled a great cloud of smoke circling me. I moved through, unsure of myself, making discoveries about the room and the bathroom as if I'd never been there before. How long had I been here? And where was here? I paused in the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror. The face I saw seemed to change right before my eyes, and for a moment I thought I was looking at a boy. It only lasted a second or two, but it made my heart pound and took my breath away. After I dressed, I poked my head out of the room and looked up and down the corridor. The floors gleamed in the rays of sunshine that came through the windows. Suddenly, the door across from mine opened and a girl about my age stepped out. She looked sickeningly thin. "How are you?" she asked softly. "We're all worried and sick about you last night." "I don't know," I said with my hands. She started to smile and then stopped. "Why are you doing that?" she said. "Doing what?" I sighed. She seemed to understand. "Why are you doing that stuff with your hands? Sign language," she asked. "Has something happened to your voice? Can't you talk?" I shook my head. She just stared at me, her face thin and her eyes looked like they were floating in their sockets. I could even see the bones in her jaw and her cheek through the skin. A thought brought a strange soft smile to her thin lips. "You look like you don't remember me," she said, and then asked, "Do you?" I shook my head again. "I'm Mary Beth." "Who am I?" I asked her, pointing to myself, and then raised my hands and shaking my head to understand. "You don't know who you are?" After I shook my head empathetically, she said, "You're Laura Logan. I don't know anything else because you didn't remember anything when you first came," she said. "That's terrible," she added, gazing down the hall and looking for someone, as if I were hurt and bleeding. I rubbed my stomach and indicated my mouth. "You're hungry?" I nodded and she relaxed. "Just come with me," she said. "Come on," she urged, reaching out for my hand. I took her hand and we went down the hallway together to the cafeteria. "How's she doing?" a dark-haired girl at the table Mary Beth had brought me to asked as soon as we appeared. The handsome boy beside her looked up with interest, as did the young girl on the other side of the table. "She can't talk. She's using sign language and she forgot everything, Megan." "I don't mean about herself either. Now she doesn't even know who we are, where she is, everything," Mary Beth wailed. "Oh no," Megan said, gazing back at the attendants who were staring and talking to each other. "They'll put her in the tower right next to Lydia Becker for sure. Look, Laura, I'm Megan Paxton. This is Lawrence. This is Lulu. You're at the clinic. You go up there and get what you want to eat and come back. Act as if you remember everything, okay?" I looked at Lawrence, whose look of concern impressed me. Then I nodded. "If you tell them you forgot everything about this place, they'll give you some other treatment, something like electric shock maybe. That would mean that you're going to go to the tower." I signed a question after question, but no one understood, and I wanted to know how long I'd been there. Why was I here? Where'd I come from? And what is the tower? "Are you sure you can't talk today?" Megan asked with a grimace. I shook my head. "Great, you're in deep water, I'm afraid," she said. "It's hard enough around here to protect yourself when you can talk." "I'll take her to the cafeteria line," Mary Beth offered. "That's like the blind leading the blind," Mary quipped. "If you help her pick out food, she'll starve." "Don't worry, I'll make sure she gets what she wants to eat," Mary Beth insisted. "I can take her," Lawrence said, rising. "Me too," Lulu said. "Why was everyone concerned about me? Remember, if you make it look like she's helpless, they'll notice," Megan warned. "Sit down, Lulu." "Just follow me," Lawrence said softly. "I'll do all the talking, and you just nod, okay?" All of a sudden, he can help someone. Before this, he couldn't tie his own shoelaces if someone was watching, Megan remarked with a twisted smile. Lawrence ignored her and directed me to follow. I can understand a little sign language, he said, and I can learn the rest fast. Don't worry, I'll protect you, he promised. After I got my food and returned to the table, I did feel less tentative and insecure. I listened to their conversation and ate. Every once in a while, Lawrence turned to me and asked how I would say or ask for something through signing. I showed him and he committed it quickly to memory. Someone else, someone in my past, learned sign language that quickly, I remembered. I could see myself teaching him. Who was he? Everything I did raised another question about who I was and where I belonged, and every question felt like a needle in my side, demanding attention. You shouldn't be encouraging her, Megan warned. She won't snap out of it as fast. She'll be fine, Lawrence said, smiling at me. Listen to him. Dr. Lawrence Taylor. Hang a shingle over your room door, Megan said. She looked at the doorway, then leaned toward me. Here comes Mrs. Klinkner. You better not act too stupid, she advised. How are we doing now, Miss Klinkner asked as she approached our table. Fine and dandy, Miss Klinkner. We're absolutely a happy little group of idiots and screwballs, Megan remarked with a fat smile. You're not really that funny, Megan. I'm hoping you'll realize that soon, for your own sake as well as everyone else's, she added. Oh, I'll try, Miss Klinkner, Megan promised with a false smile on her lips. Miss Klinkner turned to me. I understand you've lost your voice. I looked at Megan and Lawrence and then at her before I nodded. Very well, Miss Klinkner continued. You have your session with Dr. Sotheby now. Come along, Laura, she said. I looked at the others. Their eyes were wide with concern. Good luck with your doctor, Megan said as I stood up. I hope things go better with you this time, she added, telling me that I had met him before. I smiled and signed my thanks and left with Miss Klinkner. Dr. Sotheby wasn't in his office when I was brought there. Mrs. Klinkner had me take a seat in front of the big desk and then left. I sat quietly, waiting, gazing at everything, wondering how it could be that I had been here before. None of it even looked vaguely familiar. A side door opened and Dr. Sotheby entered. He smiled softly and went to his desk. So, he began as soon as he sat, you've had a little setback, I understand. Lost your voice? I didn't know what else to do, so I nodded. You can use sign language, he said. I know it well. I feel like I was in a foreign country and finally found another person who spoke my language. The questions flowed out of me so quickly, my hands could barely keep up. Dr. Sotheby's eyes followed his, and his smile widened and widened. Whoa, he cried. Let's take it one at a time. You're in a clinic for people who have mental and psychological problems. It's a clinic mainly for young people. It was established by a foundation funded by wealthy people and has become one of the most prestigious and successful institutions of its kind in the Northeast, if I may say so, he added proudly. I'm one of the chief therapists here, and your case has been assigned to me. As we were discussing yesterday, you suffered serious traumatic experience, and has affected your memory. You have a form of general amnesia, but it's a sort of amnesia that won't last long. I feel confident of that. Yes, he said after I signed my question. When you first arrived here, you could speak, but you couldn't recall anything about yourself. I signed, why can't I speak now? I don't know yet, he said, looking very thoughtful. I'm just learning about your background myself, and the information I need is slow coming, unfortunately, he said with a grimace. However, since you know sign language so well, it's something that's obviously in your background. Someone close to you is deaf. Does that jog your memory a bit? I thought. Yes, I told him, but I can't remember much about her right now. You will. Suddenly you'll see someone else doing it and you'll realize who it is, he promised. Until then, since you're unable to speak, he reached into the drawer and came up with a notebook. I would like you to write down everything you remember, everything you think, and anything that occurs about yourself or people here, anything, he said, handing me the notebook. I took it gingerly. I know you have a lot of anxiety. Do you experience flashbacks, hear voices you don't recognize? I nodded. You're eating well, apparently. That's good. Do you have any numbing, any part of your body that feels detached? I shook my head. Good. Just so you know what to expect from me, I'm going to try to get you, slowly of course, to relive the trauma that you suffered. We have to undo unnecessary shame and guilt. It's all right for you to get angry and eventually to grieve, Laura. When you're able to do so, you'll return fully to yourself. I might employ hypnosis. We'll see, okay, he said, his voice soft and comforting. I nodded. That's good. Okay, Laura, he said, let's do something now. Let's both relax and you tell me whatever comes to your mind. Words, pictures, anything. Go on, he said. Close your eyes and just let your mind wander. I did so. Pictures flashed, but each for only a split second. I saw sand in the water. Faces that I couldn't attach to a name. Small boats and cranberries in a bog. I described each thing to him. That's good, Laura. That's progress. In short time, all these apparently unconnected images will start linking up for you, and you'll start to find meaning. You're on your way home, I promise, he said. The best thing for you to do here is relax. Enjoy the facilities. Write in your notebook and rest. You're going to cure yourself, he said. He sounded so confident and sincere, I felt better. He talked about the other patients with similar problems and how they overcame and returned to be active, healthy lives. He assured me that whatever was wrong with me would end and I would never return to the clinic once I left. Try to remember something. Try to say something to me before you leave today, Laura, he concluded. He got up and walked over to me, taking my hand into his and looking so intently into my eyes, I couldn't look away. Go on, say your name, try, he urged. I opened my mouth and moved my lips. That's it, he coaxed. Go ahead. My tongue lifted and fell. I felt the muscles in my neck and throat strain. I started to gag. Tears burned under my eyelids. I felt my cheeks turn red and hot. Okay, he said, patting my hand. Okay, it'll come back. He patted my hand and returned to his chair. I have to do some research on you, Laura. I have to call out and gather the information I need. You and I will meet again tomorrow, he said. And in a week's time, at the most, you'll see some dramatic changes, okay? I nodded and smiled. I decided he was a very nice doctor, someone I could probably trust, only at the moment I had nothing to trust him with except my immediate feelings. He took me out to the secretary. Mrs. Broadhaven didn't get to show you some of the facilities yesterday, Laura. She wants to do that now, okay? I nodded and the pretty woman rose and led me out. We have very nice arts and crafts studios here, she explained. It's just down the hall from the lounge. I glanced through the door at some of the patients watching television, playing chess and reading. In the rear, a young man was playing ping pong with an attendant. Here's the studio, she said, pausing at the door further down the corridor. I looked in and saw Megan wearing a frock and dabbing roughly at some soft clay that she was forming. Lulu and Mary Beth were painting watercolors. A tall woman with beautiful red hair and milky white complexion approached us. This is Laura, Mrs. Broadhaven said. I'm showing her around, but she might come right back here, she added, seeing the interest in my face. Laura, this is Mrs. Dungan, our art therapist. Hi, Laura, she said, offering her hand. You can choose any format to work with. Clay, oils, watercolors, wood. We can make ceramics, too. I sensed something familiar. I know an artist, I thought, but I couldn't remember his name. Mrs. Duggan saw how hard I was staring at Megan's sculpture. Do you want to try that today, she asked. It might help you remember things, Mrs. Broadhaven suggested. I nodded. I'll bring her right back, Mrs. Broadhaven told Mrs. Dungan. She then showed me the library, where I saw Lawrence sitting at the table poring over a book. He had a small pile of other books beside it. As soon as he saw us, he blushed. We're very proud of our library facilities here, Laura, Mrs. Broadhaven said. It's as good as any small college library, isn't it, Lawrence? She asked him. What? Oh, yes, he said. He looked frightened, and I wondered why. His eyes shifted quickly, and I saw his hand was shaking. Well, Laura, what would you like to do? Go back to the studio? Mrs. Broadhaven asked. Either she didn't see what I noticed about Lawrence, or she chose to ignore it. I nodded and looked back once more at Lawrence, who now had his hands over his eyes, and then we left to return to the art studio. Miss Dungan set me up with a smock and placed me at a table with a mold of clay. After showing me how to use some of the tools, she went to attend patients. Megan, who had been working intently on her piece, paused and came over to sit beside me. She looked at my formless mound and then at me. They're hoping you'll do something revealing, something they can analyze. They like to get into your head and dissect you like a frog, she laughed. I know what Dr. Thomas expects me to say every time I do a piece. He sits back and nods and then asks me, what do I think I've made? Without hesitating, I say a phallic symbol. She added when I didn't respond. A penis, she laughed. I tried to make something else, but just because everything I make has some vaguely similar shape. She paused. She shook her head at me. How long are you going to be dumb? I talk to myself enough as it is. Can't you talk to me and pretend to be dumb with the others? Forget it, she added quickly. Do your own thing. Everyone else does. She looked away, and when she turned back, the crazy look in her eyes startled me. Today's visitors' day, They'll be around to see their precious children working and playing in therapy. My mother probably won't come. My father won't. No, you don't know that, but I'm telling you he won't. Maybe my mother will come, she added. She looked at me. I wonder if anyone will come for you, she said. And suddenly that became the most intriguing idea of all. Visitors who came throughout the remainder of the day, some spent the time with their children in the lobby or in the rec room, but most went outside and walked the grounds. I saw that Lawrence's mother and father came to visit him. They were an elegant-looking couple. His father was tall, easily 6'2" or 3", with graying hair. When he turned my way, I saw he had a strong, handsome face, and his features chiseled like Lawrence's. His mother was an attractive woman who wore light brown hair and a stylish bob. She wore a pretty flowered dress and shiny black heels. From where I watched, it looked like Lawrence's parents were doing all the talking. Occasionally, Lawrence nodded, then he turned and saw me staring at him and his parents through the window of the art studio. He looked embarrassed, but smiled nevertheless and moved his hands to wave hello. I waved back and smiled. Both his parents looked my way, and Lawrence quickly turned and continued to talk to them. His mother's gaze intrigued me for a moment before she joined him and his father. After that, I caught a glimpse of Mary Beth walking with her mother. Mary Beth had her head down and her mother was talking so quickly it looked like she was lecturing. Her mother was a very pretty woman, tall and thin, with shoulder-length blonde hair that curled slightly around her face. She looked like a model or an actress. They disappeared around the corner, Mary Beth never raising her head and her mother never stopping her lecture. Megan, Lulu, and I remained in the studio working throughout the afternoon. No one came to see Lulu, and Megan let me know that her own mother had sent word that she couldn't come today. It's not hard to figure out why she hates seeing me, Megan muttered, sitting at my side again as I worked on my sculpture. She blames me for what my father did to me. Can you imagine that? She gets a divorce and blames me for her life now. I know it's true. You don't have to look at me like that. The doctor agrees with me. Oh, he won't come right out and say it, but he's met my mother and he agrees. So what? So let her blame me. Who needs her, she said. What did your father do to you? I signed. What, she said, as if I suddenly was realizing she'd been talking to me. What are you saying? I can't understand all those stupid hand movements. I don't know why you can't suddenly talk. I thought finally I would have someone with some brains to talk to. And then you go and lose your voice and start doing this. What are you saying? She's asking about your mother, Mrs. Dungan said, as she passed us with an armful of colored paper. My father, she turned to me. Why are you interested all of a sudden? You look like I'm making things up, is that it? I shook my head vigorously. Just mind your own business, she snapped and returned to her clay figure. Suddenly she began pounding it madly. Miss Duggan came rushing over. Megan, what are you doing? Please, honey, stop that, she said calmly. Megan continued to batter the clay until it lost its shape. Then she sat down hard on her chair and started to laugh. Sorry, she said, I guess there's nothing to analyze this week. She started to laugh again and then began to cry, but strangely, although there were tears coming from her eyes, her face remained still and her lips unmoving. You better take a rest, honey, Mrs. Duggan said, and put her arm around Megan's shoulders. Come on. Megan stood up and let herself be led out of the studio. I returned to my own sculpture for a while and then gazed out the window and saw Lauren's parents had gone. He was alone, sitting on the bench, staring at me. When Mrs. Dungan returned, I asked her if I could go outside now. I suppose, sure, she said. We'll leave your piece just as it is, and you can return to it tomorrow, okay? I nodded and left the studio. Lawrence looked up and smiled warmly as I came down the pathway. Hi, he said. How's your artwork coming? I shook my head. I wouldn't exactly call it art, I signed. He seemed to understand and nodded. I liked the fact that he didn't try to convince me otherwise and fill my head with false ideas about being talented. You want to take a walk? We can go take a view of the ocean. I turned and gazed in the direction he indicated. It's still pretty nice out, he continued. I turned back to him, hearing his note of displeasure. My parents aren't that crazy about coming up here. It's an embarrassment. I am the only member of the family to end up in the loony bin. Oh, I didn't mean it that way, he said quickly. I mean, I don't think of you as loony. I'm loony. Megan's a real loon, but you're not. Something wrong with me, I signed. I pointed to my head and shook it. Whatever's wrong with you will be easily cured. You won't be anywhere near as long as I've been, I'm sure. Want to walk? I was reluctant, but I finally agreed and we started down the path. My father's a stockbroker, he said. Very successful one, too. He's got high-profile clients. My mother usually buys whatever she wants. You should see her closet. It's as big as some people's bedrooms. She even has a vanity table in there. I smiled. I'm not exaggerating, he said. When I was a little boy, I hid out in that closet. She always yelled at me for it. And you should see her jewelry. She's got enough to stock a small store. What about your mother? Have you tried remembering her? Did you live in a big house? I thought and shook my head. No. That's strange. I bet your mother was probably the first person that you're gonna remember. Well, there it is, he said, stopping, and I looked up. Through the tall maple trees, I could see the ocean, its blue sheen glimmering in the late afternoon sunlight. I stepped back. What? He said. I shook my head. You're afraid of the ocean? He thought a moment. It has something to do with what happened to you then. I was reading about your problem. I looked it up in our library. That's what I was doing when you came with Miss Broadhaven. The only way you're going to get well is to confront what happened, he said. That's Dr. Sotheby's job to get you to do that. He looked at the sea and then at me. You want to try to go closer? Maybe it'll revive your memory. I shook my head empathetically. Okay, he said. We'll go back, huh? I nodded, but chanced another glimpse of the water. Images began to parade through my mind. Faces, lobster traps, boats, the beach, cranberry bog, someone singing, and then someone calling my name, whispering at first, then calling me louder, louder. It seemed like I was calling myself. I felt my throat tighten, and with the effort to pronounce someone else's name. Lawrence's eyes widened as I brought my hands to my neck and shook my head. Is something wrong? Are you all right, Laura? Impulsively, I threw myself into his arm and buried myself in his shoulder, and I sobbed and cried for reasons I couldn't explain. All I wanted to do was cry and keep crying until the well of tears went dry. At first, Lawrence just stood there with his arms at his side, not knowing what to do. Then he embraced me slowly and held me closely. He stroked the back of my hair and kept repeating my name. Laura, Laura. Finally, my sobbing ended and I pulled back slowly. He looked happy but very concerned. Are you all right now? I nodded, and he wiped the tears from my cheeks with his handkerchief. I better get you back before they come looking for us, he said. He turned me around and reached out for my hand. We started along the path again. This time I didn't look back at the ocean, not even for a second. I was happy when it disappeared behind us, but I knew that soon, very soon, I would have to return, perhaps by myself, and stare at that water until the truth in my memory broke free of the chains I had thrown around it. Only then would I get these chains off myself.